What if you were kidnapped, only to discover that the woman you've taken holds the power to change your fate? In a battle between greed and ancient forces, the truth may be more terrifying than you ever imagined. Aminata was known across the land, her name whispered in every village, on the lips of travelers, and even the wind seemed to carry stories of her radiance. Her beauty was beyond compare, the kind of beauty that drew people in like a fire that could not be ignored. Her skin shimmered like gold in the sunlight, her hair dark as the night sky, flowing like a river of silk. To see Aminata was to witness something divine, a vision sent from the heavens. She was a gift to the earth and the pride of her father, an esteemed merchant known for his wisdom and generosity, had ensured that Aminata lacked nothing. He showered her with jewels and finery, his wealth known far and wide. His home was a palace in the hearts of the people, where feasts were held and music filled the air. Aminata's life, on the surface, was a dream of life many could only wish for. But with this beauty and wealth came a price. The whispers of her beauty, like a dark shadow, spread far and wide. Her wealth was the greatest attraction of all. Among the many who looked upon her with desire, there were those who saw Aminata not as a woman, but as a prize. To possess her, they believed, would mean riches beyond imagination. Some sought her heart, others her wealth, and in the shadows of these desires, danger slowly began to creep. Aminata, with all her beauty and grace, could not see the growing threat that loomed over her. She was too pure, too untouched by the darkness that lived in the hearts of men who hungered for wealth. One such man was Sefu, a leader of a group of young men who had grown desperate. They had heard the rumors of Aminata's beauty and her father's wealth, and in their hearts, they knew that if they could capture her, their lives would be forever changed. It was said that Sefu had eyes that gleamed with ambition, a mind sharp and cunning. In his mind, the path to greatness lay in seizing Aminata. The thought of her, bound by his will, filled him with a twisted sort of excitement. No longer would he be a man of the village. He would become a king, a ruler, with riches and power beyond measure. And so, Sefu and his men began to plot, and as Aminata moved through the streets of her village, unaware of the danger, the web around her grew tighter. It was a calm evening, the festival lights flickering in the distance, when the first threads of that danger began to unravel, setting the course for events that would forever change their lives. While Aminata was coming home from the festival, she was kidnapped. The cave was cold. The stone walls seemed to pulse with the weight of 1,000 secrets, buried deep within their bones. Aminata had been dragged through the darkness, her feet scraping along the rough, uneven ground. Yet, as her captors grew more frantic and their voices more frantic, a stillness descended upon her. It was as if she were no longer a part of this world, her mind no longer bound by fear or pain, but floating in some other space, somewhere beyond her body. As she was pulled further into the depths of the cave, the noises of the outside world grew faint, and only the murmurs of her captors filled the air. The men, once confident in their prize, were now beginning to argue. Their voices, sharp and harsh, echoed off the walls, but Aminata no longer reacted. Her eyes, once wide with the terror of captivity, now appeared unfocused, as though she were staring far beyond the walls of the cave, seeing something that the others could not. The quiet power within her began to awaken, a force that had been lying dormant for years. She could feel it stirring deep within her bones, a calling from somewhere ancient. Something beyond her understanding. The ropes that bound her felt less restricting now, as if the air itself had softened them. Her skin, once warm to the touch, began to cool, and the faintest shimmer appeared on her body. It started as a soft glow, a gentle radiance that seemed to come from within. Her body, once so human, began to change. The transformation was slow, as though she were becoming one with the earth around her. The men were so absorbed in their own bickering that they failed to notice the quiet shift in the atmosphere. Their leader, Sefu, shouted commands, his voice sharp and authoritative. His desire for wealth and power overpowered everything else. But the others, Quain, Yarrow, and the others, began to feel a strange unease settle in their stomachs. The air grew thick, heavy with something they could not explain. Suddenly, there was a soft, eerie silence. The argument ceased. All eyes turned toward Aminata, who sat motionless in the dim light. The glow around her grew brighter, flickering like the first light of dawn. Her once ordinary hair began to twist and coil, becoming serpentine, shifting with a life of its own. It was as if her body was no longer bound by human form, but but was being shaped into something else entirely. A serpent, long and graceful, with shimmering scales that caught the dim light of the cave. Her golden eyes burned with a wisdom that none of the men could fathom. Sefu's voice faltered as he stared at her. What is this? His voice was barely a whisper, a mix of fear and disbelief. Aminata's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. There was no anger in her gaze, no malice, just a calm, knowing stillness. It was as though she could see right through him, through his heart, through his soul. This is not a trick, Quaim said softly, his voice trembling with both fear and awe. He had seen many things in his short life, but nothing like this. Aminata, now a creature of serpentine beauty and ancient wisdom, was no longer just a woman to be ransomed. She was something far greater, something they could not control. Sefu waved his hand dismissively. Do not be weak, Quaim. She is trying to confuse us. We came here for ransom, and we will leave with it. But even Sefu, despite his bravado, could not shake the unease growing in his chest. His eyes darted from Aminata's glowing form to his men, searching for reassurance, but all he found were faces filled with doubt and fear. The transformation before them was not a trick. It was real. Quaim swallowed hard, unable to tear his eyes away from Aminata. This is no ordinary woman, Sefu. Look at her eyes, her skin. She is not of this world. Sefu clenched his fists, trying to quell the rising fear in his chest. She is nothing. We will take her back to her father, collect the ransom, and we will be rich. That is all that matters. But the others were not so sure. Iro, a man who had always followed Sefu's lead, now stood with his back against the wall, his eyes wide with uncertainty. What if it's true? He whispered, almost to himself. What if she's something more? Aminata remained silent, but her presence spoke louder than words ever could. The glow around her seemed to pulse, not in time with any earthly rhythm, but with something older, deeper and ancient heartbeat. Her serpent-like form, beautiful and terrifying, seemed to embody the earth itself. Her eyes filled with a wisdom that came from beyond the realm of men. Do you feel it? Quaim asked, his voice a mere whisper. It's as if the air itself is changing, as if the very earth beneath our feet is alive. Seth refused to acknowledge his men's doubts. Enough, he snapped, his voice hard. We have a plan, and we will see it through. I will not be swayed by superstition. There's gold waiting for us, and we will have it. But even as he spoke the words, he could feel the tension growing. The cave, once a simple hiding place, now felt like a prison. The walls, which had once seemed unremarkable, now seemed to pulse with an unseen force. The air grew thick, the shadows in the cave stretching unnaturally long. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as though it were alive, as though it was aware of the men's greed. Aminata's transformation was far from complete. Her form was still shifting, her body still adjusting to the ancient, power coursing through her veins. But as her transformation continued, so did the growing unease among the kidnappers. It was no longer just fear of the unknown, no longer just a recognition that they had captured someone far beyond their understanding. It was the dawning realization that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The wind outside howled, the sound carrying into the cave like a warning. It was a warning that the kidnappers could not ignore. Aminata's golden eyes glowed brighter now, and though she did not speak, the men could hear her message. Clearly, her eyes spoke of ancient things, of forgotten wisdom, of powers that had existed long before the men had come into this world. Her gaze pierced the veil between their world and the next, and she seemed to be judging them, silently asking them to face the truth of their actions. Do you not see? Quaim asked, his voice quivering. This is not about wealth. This is about something much greater. We have disturbed forces we cannot understand. Sefu glared at him, his grip tightening around his weapon. Enough, Quaim. Stop talking like a child. We will take her back. We will take our gold. But even as he spoke, he felt the weight of Aminata's presence, felt the full force of her power pressing down on him. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the shadows growing longer, as though the very cave itself was closing in. Around them, the walls seemed to whisper, their voices inaudible, but laden with meaning. The air was heavy with something beyond their comprehension. As the days passed, the tension among the kidnappers grew. Aminata's transformation was now complete. Her serpent form had fully emerged, her body glowing with a light that seemed to come from within. She was no longer the woman they had captured, but something ancient, something far beyond the realms of human understanding. Her eyes, burning with a golden fire, looked out over the men with a quiet patience, as if waiting for them to see the truth. Claim, once certain of his actions, now found himself questioning everything. The wealth they had sought now seemed insignificant, meaningless in the face of the power they had unleashed. The air around them grew thick with an unsettling silence, a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The other men, though they did not speak, could feel it too. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, held captive not by ropes, but by the weight of their own guilt. As night fell and the men gathered in the cave, Aminata's silence seemed to grow heavier. She did not need to speak. Her presence alone was enough to shake them to their core. The winds outside howled, the shadows stretched longer, and the earth beneath their feet seemed to tremble in anticipation. Aminata was not just a captive. She was something far more, a symbol of a power they could not control, a force of nature that would judge them for their greed. The gold they had sought now seemed small and insignificant in comparison to the ancient forces they had disturbed. The men were no longer in control of their own fate. The choices they made now would determine their destiny, and in the silence of the cave, with Aminata's golden eyes fixed upon them, they were forced to face their own greed, their own fear, and the consequences of their actions. The kidnappers sat in tense silence, their hearts weighed down by the strange events unfolding around them. The air was heavy with an eerie stillness that seemed to press in on them from all sides. They had no idea how much time had passed, but the sensation that something was about to change lingered in the air. The cave, once a place of refuge, had become something far darker, more unsettling. Suddenly, the stillness was broken by the soft sound of footsteps. At the entrance of the cave appeared an elderly woman, garbed in flowing white robes, her presence commanding yet serene. The kidnappers stared at her in disbelief. The woman was ancient, yet her face radiated wisdom, as if she had lived through centuries. Her age was difficult to place, for she seemed neither of the world nor beyond it. She stepped into the cave without fear, her feet not quite touching the ground. As though guided by some invisible force, the very air seemed to bend around her, rippling with an energy the men could not comprehend. Her eyes, glowing with an inner light, scanned the men as if seeing through them, reading their very souls. Her presence was calming, yet her power was undeniable. The kidnappers were paralyzed by her otherworldly aura, unsure whether to approach or run. When she spoke, her voice echoed through the cave like the rumblings of distant thunder, shaking them to their core. Your greed, she began, her tone deep and commanding, has disturbed the balance of the earth. You have taken what does not belong to you, and in doing so, you have awakened forces beyond your understanding. You do not see what you have taken, what you have captured, but I see. The woman you hold is no mere human. She is not simply flesh and blood, but a spirit. She is the Serpent, a manifestation of nature's power, of wisdom, renewal, and change. The men could not speak. They had heard of spirits, of the power of nature, but they had never believed it to be so real, so tangible. The woman's words filled the cave like a storm, and they felt themselves quaking under the weight of her gaze. She continued, her voice heavy with authority. You think you seek wealth, but you do not understand the price you pay. You disturb the natural order, and the earth itself shall rise against you. The leader, Sefu, tried to stand firm. This woman may be more than she seems, he said, his voice trembling but determined. But we have plans. We have a ransom to collect, and nothing will stand in our way. The woman's eyes never left him, and she smiled a sad, knowing smile. You cannot stop what is already set in motion. Your greed has already set the earth against you. There is no ransom that will save you from what is to come. The tension in the cave thickened. The other kidnappers, who had been silently observing, began to shift uncomfortably. The woman had spoken with a power they could not ignore. They had expected to hold all the cards, to manipulate the situation to their advantage, but now they were faced with something they couldn't control. Sefu's defiance grew stronger, though his mind raced with thoughts of wealth and power. He would not be swayed by a mere spirit. I will not be intimidated by your threats, he shouted, his voice growing more desperate. We will proceed with the ransom, whatever it takes. The woman's expression remained unchanged. You will proceed, she said calmly, but know that you will face the consequences of your actions. Greed blinds you, and it will blind you to the destruction that follows. Sefu's confidence faltered, but he refused to show weakness. Enough, he barked. We do this my way. We'll get the ransom, and when we do, I'll be the one who laughs last." But as he spoke, the ground beneath them began to tremble. At first, it was subtle, a slight vibration beneath their feet, like the earth was stretching, waking from a deep slumber. Then, the tremor grew stronger, the cave walls groaning as though they were alive, as if the very rocks were whispering in ancient tongues. The woman raised her hands, and the trembling of the earth intensified. "You think you control this world," she said softly, her voice rising over the shaking ground. "But you are but children in the face of nature's power." Suddenly, the cave shook violently. The air grew thick with energy, and the ground cracked, open beneath their feet. The men staggered, falling to their knees, gripped by a fear they had never known. The blinding light filled the cave, so intense that it was as if the sun itself had descended into their midst. The air grew hot, the temperature rising to unbearable levels. The kidnappers gasped for breath, their bodies trembling in terror. The very rocks of the cave seemed to shift, rippling as though alive, and the walls reverberated with the whispers of ancient spirits, their voices murmuring in languages the men could not understand. The woman's voice rang out once more, firm and clear, even as the earth shook violently around them. "You are not in control here. This is not your world. You cannot claim what does not belong to you, for the earth will always take back what you steal." The cave's shaking grew more intense. The light that filled the cave seemed to pulse, and the temperature became unbearable. The kidnappers had no choice but to fall to the ground, their faces twisted in fear. Even Sefu, the leader, could no longer stand with his usual defiance. His knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, his body trembling. And then, just as quickly as it began, the shaking stopped, the light dimmed, and the temperature returned to normal. The cave fell into a deathly silence, the energy from the spirits still lingering in the air like a heavy fog. The woman, unmoved by the chaos, stood in the center of the cave, her presence as calm and powerful as ever. "You see now," she said softly, "you are not in control. The earth is not yours to command." The kidnappers were left shaken, their minds reeling with the weight of what had just occurred. They had not expected this, no one could have. The woman's warning had struck them deep, and the reality of their actions now loomed over them like a storm cloud. In that moment, they realized the truth. They had not simply kidnapped a woman, they had disturbed the very balance of nature itself, and they were powerless to undo the damage they had done. But the woman had not come to destroy them. No, she had come to teach them. She had come to show them the path of redemption. "You are not beyond saving," she said, her voice now softer, gentler. "But you must change. You must repent for your greed, for it has tainted your souls. You must acknowledge the wrong you have done, and you must vow to never again let greed cloud your hearts." The kidnappers, still on their knees, looked up at her, their eyes filled with fear and regret. The woman's words had pierced through them, and they understood that their fate now rested in their hands. They had been given a chance to repent, to return to the light. But would they take it? Or would they allow their pride and greed to drag them further into darkness? The choice was theirs, but the consequences would be far-reaching. Aminata's return to her father's home was quiet. The trial she had faced seemed distant now, but her presence, though calm, held something deeper. Her father stood at the entrance of their home, eyes wide with relief, his heart heavy with a mix of joy and sorrow. The moment he saw her, all the years of wealth and influence seemed insignificant compared to the preciousness of his daughter's safety. He hurried toward her, his arms trembling as he reached out to hold her. "Aminata," his voice cracked, full of emotion, "you're back. I feared you were lost to me forever." Without a word, she stepped into his embrace. He held her tightly, as if he might never let her go. Aminata said nothing. She did not speak of the cave, of the serpentine transformation, or the divine woman. She had no need to. Her father's embrace was enough. She simply rested in his arms, feeling the warmth of his love and protection. He pulled back slightly to look at her face, his eyes filled with both relief and concern. "What happened, my daughter? What did they do to you?" His voice was full of worry, but Aminata remained silent. She offered him a small, knowing smile, a smile that spoke more than words ever could. It was a smile that carried the weight of wisdom, of deep understanding, but also of an unspoken sorrow for the knowledge gained in the silence of her journey. Aminata's father, though eager to know what had transpired, did not press her for answers. He sensed, as any father might, that some things could not be spoken. Some truths were not yet ready to be shared. He simply nodded, feeling the weight of her silence. She had returned, but she was different, changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. As the days passed, Aminata continued to remain quiet, her thoughts far from her father's wealth, his power, and his influence. She had returned, but not as the same woman who had left. Her silence spoke volumes. There was a calm in her now, a quiet strength that came from understanding the forces of the world that could never be tamed by human hands. Meanwhile, the kidnappers, now free from their curse, walked away from their greed and remorse, haunted by the serpent's lesson. The fear they felt was a reminder that their ambition had led them down a dark path, one they could never undo. They had witnessed the power of something far greater than themselves. Their hearts, once filled with greed, now carried a burden of guilt. No wealth, no treasure could undo the lesson they had learned. Aminata sat in the quiet of her father's home, reflecting on all that had happened. The kidnapping, the transformation, the spirits, everything seemed distant now, almost like another life. But she understood now that true wealth was not in gold or land, but in the knowledge of the earth's wisdom, the balance between the forces of nature and the human heart. She had been given a glimpse into a world that could not be controlled, a world where greed had no place, and in the silence of her return, she knew that the greatest treasure was not something that could be held in the hand, but something that shaped the soul. To watch more stories like this, subscribe to our channel.